Good evening to all. First and foremost, I want to welcome my dear friend DEMI, who is here with us tonight. DEMI, welcome. And welcome to the second lecture that we're holding tonight with our dear friend Professor Alejandro Anreus. I wrote like maybe 20 pages for this introduction, but I'm going to be brief and to the point. I started thinking, what is it that brings us together here tonight? And what is the exact bond that actually unites Ramon and myself to Professor Alejandro, to DEMI, and to our dear friend Gina Pellón, who passed away a few years back? And it's basically, a friend told me, when she came in tonight, she said, you know, there's always magic at Cernuda Arte. Yeah. And it's this magical moment again where the principal things that unite us, that the real bond among us is first and foremost friendship, and then the passion for the arts, specifically for Cuban art in Ramon and in my case, but the arts in general. And then this fascinating world of sharing so many beautiful things that brings us together, like in a night like tonight. We can tell so many stories about Gina Pellón, who is a fascinating artist, and how we fell in love with Gina's work once we met her, and with her as a person, and how we shared so many beautiful memories back in the day when we used to visit her in Paris, or when she used to come to Miami. We can write a beautiful book about that. Mm-hmm. And then about DEMI, how we adored her work from the very beginning when we saw that she was starting to paint, and she wouldn't show us what she was doing because she was shy about it. And we told her, you're doing great, this is wonderful work, come on, keep at it. And she has. And with our dear friend Alejandro Anreus, who's been also a mentor, just as Juan Martinez was in our lives, and all this love for what we do and our passion for Cuban art, that's what really, that's the most important thing for us. No? I have a quote here which is very beautiful. It's a quote by Frank Lloyd Wright that says, and I quote, "Talent is good, practice is better, and passion is best." It's all about the passion, my friends. So I welcome you. By the way, this is like, in my book club, we recently reread The Movable Feast, A Movable Feast by Hemingway. And this tonight, since we had our first lecture yesterday, and the same emotions came up, and all this loving and the friendship, and this is like part 2 of A Movable Feast. So welcome, and with this, my dear friend, come and teach us again some more about tonight, about Gina and DEMI.
Again, buenas noches. Thank you, Nersis, for that introduction, and thank you for not making me cry like Ramon did last night. One gets to a certain age that one has to be very careful. I also want to acknowledge DEMI's presence here, and I will talk at length about her and her art shortly. But I also want to acknowledge the presence of two very dear friends of mine who are spiritual brothers of mine, and that's my dear friend psychologist Manny Perez and El Poetazo, Andres Reinaldo. I know all of you know him as a journalist, but I assure you, he's all right as a journalist. But as a poet, hay que quitarse el sombrero. Tonight I will speak about two visionary artists, Gina Pellón and DEMI. What makes artists visionaries? I'm not referring to folk artists or artists like William Blake, whose art comes from strictly spiritual visions, even though spiritual visions are very much an integral part of DEMI's vision. But rather, I'm referring to artists who reveal their visual language and then continue to develop that language in an organic, authentic manner, and do not allow their art to be dictated to or manipulated by the latest fashion. Two such artists are the subjects of my talk this evening, Gina Pellón and DEMI. They share that rare thing in today's world, the integrity of being true to themselves and to their art. Born December 26, 1926, in Cumanayagua, Las Villas, Gina Pellón attended the San Alejandro Academy of Fine Arts, graduating in 1954. Years later, she would recall, and I quote, "Yes, the academy was conventional and conservative, but there I learned the basics and acquired my craft as a painter." End of quote. At the academy, and this is very significant, she befriended fellow artist Antonia Eiris, whom she would consider mi hermana, my sister, for the rest of her life. And what I want you to keep in mind is that you're seeing work by Gina down here upstairs, where there's basically a marvelous mini retrospective of DEMI. There's also a room full of Antonia Eiris. Gina and Antonia are two sides of the same coin. So I urge you to look at Gina's work and then Antonia's work after my talk. Immediately upon graduation, she began to earn her living as an art teacher, eventually teaching at the Polytechnic Institute of my neighborhood, Vedado, through 1957. There she taught children, and she would recall many years later that she encouraged them to visually tell their stories with lines and colors, expressing themselves freely. And in her words, be able to say a narrative, but say it with shapes and colors and textures. While still an art student in 1953, Pellón began to exhibit in group shows, first at the Círculo de Bellas Artes in Havana, then in other collective exhibitions. She was also friendly with artists of her generation who favored abstraction, such as the Grupo Los Once. With the arrival of the revolution in 1959, the new regime created a series of scholarships for artists to study outside the island. Pellón applied, but a scholarship was not granted. She decided she needed to get to Paris, regardless. She contacted a steamship company to find free passage. The manager told her if she brought 12 scholarship students to travel, she would get free passage. Pellón, in that incredibly Cuban overbearing way that we have of overdoing things, ended up bringing 50 scholarship students to be passengers. The young painter left Cuba in December 1959, arriving in Paris, and this is significant, never to return. A significant biographical note: a brother of Gina was an opponent of the Castro dictatorship and was a political prisoner for many years. The Parisian stay for these young artists was limited to 3 months by the Cuban government. When Pellón was informed by the cultural attaché in France at the time, Roberto Fernández Retamar, a well-known poet, that it was time to return, she refused. And in her words, "I flatly refused. And in doing so, my opposition to the Cuban government became evident. I remained in Paris, and I became an exile." End of quote. For the past few minutes, you've been looking at 3 photos of Pellón. In the early 60s, in the middle, with fellow artists Ángela Costa León and Joaquín Ferrer, who, by the way, she was briefly married to. And there you can see, going back to Nercy's comment of a movable feast, you can see youth, you can see enjoyment, and you can see the kind of feeling that you have when you're in Paris, right? They're drinking wine, they're smiling. Life is open and in front of them. On each side are photos of Gina at work in her studio in the 1970s, and then intensely at work on a canvas just a couple of years before her death. These 3 photos give us a sense of the woman in her environment, her camaraderie, and most significantly, her joy in the act of painting. An early work from the 1960s, on the left, The Passengers of the Moon, reflects the influence of Paul Klee in his compression of space and form, but it is already, make no mistake about it, a Pellón work with its scratchy lines and rubbed and stained surfaces. The explosion of colors is around the corner, but it's already evident in the yellows, the reds, and the very subtle touches of blue. Her expressionist vision fully developed by the end of the decade. And next to it, in Dream Window on Petals of 1975, her gestural application of yellows, ochres, blues, and reds bounces off a delicate pale gray background. The figures appear and disappear in the objects, conveying the fantastic as well as the whimsical. In the early 1960s, Pellón would be invited to participate in exhibitions with the artists formerly associated with the CoBRA group, named after the members' home countries' capital cities, Copenhagen, CO, Brussels, BR, and Amsterdam, A. Its leading members were, and you can see from left to right, the Danish artist Asger Horn, the Dutch artist Karel Appel, and the Belgian artist Pierre Alechinsky. The CoBRA artists detested naturalism as well as what they called sterile abstraction. They favored freedom of color and form, violent brushwork, and a distorted figuration inspired by both primitive as well as folk art. Pellón became very close to the Danish painter Asger Horn. She would always refer to him as, he was like an older brother to me. And what is significantly is that she also understood their fusion of radical politics. They had this kind of crazy cocktail of libertarian Marxism and tongue-in-cheek anarchism. Horn would introduce Pellón to galleries in the Scandinavian countries, where she exhibited successfully. In 1986, Pellón recalled, I quote, "When I arrived with my tropical colors to the sober and great tranquility of Scandinavia, it was as if I had brought the sun to them." End of quote. In her mature work, Pellón would develop a technique where she would paint and stain the canvas with large passages of color, then add patches and strokes of more solid, thicker colors, and then use the brush almost like a crayon and draw and scribble as a way of defining the shapes. In the process of paint application, she defined the space, figure or figures, and the ground. We see this in Cendras on the left of 1984, which by the way means ash blonde, where the squiggly orange, yellow, and blue lines define the face and neck of this portrait. And yet, at first glance, if you look carefully at the picture on the left, the image is ambiguous enough to suggest two faces kissing. Next to it, The Show Is About to Begin of 1985 depicts a full figure. Is she an actress putting on makeup and getting ready to go on stage? It's possible. Framed in a yellow-orange background with white passages and blue lines, she's dressed in light colors, and these are applied in quick brushstrokes, conveying the energy of the figure. The head is defined in blue, and the deep red lips smile at the viewer. It is a life-affirming image, and this is essential in the artist's work. With few exceptions, Pellón's subjects are consistently joyous. She will also over time favor the depiction of female figures as symbols of sensuality, of life, and of beauty. The art critic José Gómez Sicre would write of the artist, I quote, "In the best Cuban plastic tradition, Pellón makes use of a brilliant palette. As a true colorist, she creates form from pigment with frenzied energy. Her compositions might be described as the work of a highly chromatic expressionist. Charged with tropical sensuality, they impart a linear vision of ambient reality." End of quote. But hers is an expressionism charged with happiness, a tropical one, with none of the gloom or angst of the Germans, the Austrians, or the Dutch expressionists. I would say that her expressionism is undoubtedly a fusion of her Caribbean roots with a magnificent cocktail of a very Cuban and very French joie de vivre. Hey, my feeling is if you're going to go through life, that's the best cocktail you can have. Her pictorial language could range from the very elaborate, you're seeing the wind carried by the snow of 92 on the left, with its golden yellow oranges and subtle greens defining the figures with the bright blue lines, to the boldly simple, as in the hat of 2008, where an intense blue background complements the orange-red hat worn by a paler colored figure. In a group of smaller pictures from 2010, we see her remain an intense colorist, but she's working against black backgrounds and utilizing collage. So she was always constantly moving and experimenting. She never stayed in a kind of repetitive mechanical process of work. The delightful Cuban finch of 2010 on the left is endowed with a sense of whimsy, which becomes even more prevalent in Pellón's late work. Painted in orange, yellow, greens, and tans, the female figure is outdoors in a landscape. Sitting on the figure's right arm is a large pink bird. Obviously, it does not look like the actual Cuban pinzón, which is small, brown, black, and yellow, but rather an imaginative evocation of a bird. The overall color scheme has a fresh and breezy quality. The woman looks soft to the side at the bird, and remember that birds are usually symbols of freedom and spiritual elevation due to their lightness and flight. But this bird seems awkward due to its size, adding a kind of clunky humor to the picture. In Starry Night, Pellón pays homage to the history of painting. Not only does she reference Van Gogh's painting of the same title, as well as the view through the composition's window, but she also references the tradition of the recumbent female figure, from Titian to Matisse. Pellón's figure is dressed, not nude, utilizing her clothing for color harmonies of green and red. Her relaxed body and contented face contemplating the evening sky. They are surrounded by blues and purples, oranges and yellows, tans and browns, and red and greens, a multicolored palette that can represent the world as a place of pleasure and enjoyment. Pellón noted, "My painting is a kind of multicolor graffiti. I believe that every artist has preconceived innate ideas, but when an artist goes into the world, the universe unfolds before her. For me, part of this unfolding is trying to capture joy in my pictures." End of quote. As Gina Pellón aged and became frailer, her colors became brighter, her brushstrokes freer, like Matisse in his late paper cutouts, or like Amelia Peláez in her final paintings. She celebrated life as she waited for death. There is no sadness, mourning, or bitterness, but rather an explosion of joyous energy. Look at the intense colors in Ready for the Dance on the left. That's from 2013. Look at the vigorous strokes and cut shapes in Come and Celebrate the Joy, also 2013. Both of these works are from the year before her passing. If you did not know that these were made by a woman born in 1926, you'd think in their vitality they were the works of a 20-year-old. Gina Pellón had one of the most illustrious careers among Cuban artists of her generation. She had over 50 solo exhibitions and participated in some 200 group exhibitions in her lifetime. Together with painting, she produced work in printmaking and tapestry design. She illustrated books of poetry, and she herself actually also published a book of her own poems. She died in Paris at the age of 87 on March 27th, 2014. And you should know that right till the very end, while she still had her health, every time there was a protest on behalf of human rights in Cuba, in the city of Paris, Gina would be there with her walking cane, letting people know how she felt about the issue. Shortly before her death, she told a journalist, "I paint every day, from dawn to dusk. In this process, I have the necessity to create, to portray the emotions, and when I am close to finishing a work, I have the temptation to start another." End of quote. Painting for Pellón was like oxygen, essential. It kept her going. And she was true to her artistic vision until the end. It is very rare for art historians to lecture much on living artists, even rarer to have them present in the room as they speak. Such is the case this evening. Add to this that I am also privileged enough to call the artist my friend, that I have had a bromance with her husbands for decades, and that I have spent countless hours in her company and studio. And I have done something none of you have done. I have even slept in her studio, next to a large painting in progress, which I will show to you. I slept in the studio, not with the artist, let's be clear about it. And of course, I am referring to dear DEMI that is here. DEMI was born in 1955 in Camagüey, Cuba, the youngest of 3 daughters. Her father was a career officer in the army who was chief of operations in Camagüey province, and her mother was a housewife who enjoyed raising her family and socializing in their milieu. They were comfortably middle class. This serene, even idyllic life came to an end with the arrival of the revolution in 1959. Her father would be arrested, accused of collaborating with the Batista regime, go through a series of trials, found guilty, and executed by firing squad in 1960. This would be a most impactful and traumatic event for DEMI, her siblings, and her mother. 2 years later, DEMI would be sent by herself via Operation Peter Pan to San Juan, Puerto Rico, to live with her father's sister. In a short amount of time, DEMI lost her father to political violence and her mother, sisters, and country due to separation and exile. This added to her sense of loss, one of displacement. She would not reunite with her mother and sisters until they were allowed to leave Cuba in 1971 and settled in Tarrytown, New York. These were difficult years for DEMI. In time, she completed high school in Tarrytown, studied bookkeeping, and began to earn her living in that profession. In 1978, she moved with her mother to Miami, where one of her sisters was already living. She continued to earn a living as a bookkeeper and lived by herself in an apartment on Biscayne Boulevard. But she felt unfulfilled, incomplete. So she took theater classes in the evening at Miami-Dade College and joined the Prometeo Theater Group. Now she had a community of like-minded folks with whom to share an interest in literature, in culture, and the arts. And through this world, she would meet a most significant person in her life. In 1980, and I think you already know who that person is, she met the painter Arturo Rodriguez. And as Lynette Bosch has written in her seminal 2018 monograph on DEMI, I quote, "That meeting was the catalyst of a renewal of DEMI's life," end of quote. Arturo, who in my view is one of the most extraordinary painters of our time, and I should tell that I have finished a monograph on Arturo that hopefully will see the light of day in the next year or two. Arturo became her friend, her lover, her husband, and her teacher. Through an apprenticeship process, not just of art, but of culture and life, DEMI's self-realization and emergence as an artist began. I love their version of Grant Wood's American Gothic. And of course, DEMI in that wonderful studio that is usually my Jesuit cell when I'm visiting them and staying with them. And this wonderful photograph of the two of them in DEMI's studio. The influences on DEMI's art are deep and rich, ranging from the paintings of Arturo Rodriguez to those of the Italian Renaissance, Flemish art, Japanese art, the 19th century painters of fairies, Richard Dadd, you see an example there. But what is significant, and I can't stress this enough, is her absorption and transformation of these various visualities into her very own language from the start. DEMI's artistic vision is grounded in a vision of childhood from the perspective of childhood. And hers is an essentially religious vision too. Hers is a world where innocence and evil come into conflict, where light and darkness collide, where suffering and loss may only be mediated through tenderness and transcendence. Early works, such as Arturo and DEMI of '84 and Boy with Florida Oranges of '86, capture both romance, the first, and mystery, the second. In the self-portrait with her lover and fellow artist, there were sailors' costumes and are in a boat. They're assisted by two duende, fairy-like figures. One holds a parasol over their heads, the other a basket of flowers by DEMI's legs. The colors are both bright and modulated, and there's an attention to subtle details in how the brushstrokes define the forms. Both facial expressions are inquisitive, with DEMI's being more serious. The picture reminds us of those late 19th century photo studio portraits set up in an artificial landscape. It is charming and has an air of romance. Boy with Florida Oranges depicts the type of hairless child we will come to expect from the artists for years to come. Demi has told me that for years she struggled and that Arturo wanted her very much to paint hair on the children. And she just couldn't, since for her, being hairless represented both innocence and vulnerability. This serious boy stands dressed in orange with a white lace collar. He's against a dark bluish background that turns light on the upper left corner. Placed between a tub-like object and fantastic flowers with tiny dancing and floating oranges that go over his head and into the tub. He manages to be self-contained and stares at us very soberly. Look at the obsessive details, and of course you can actually see the painting upstairs, applied to the flowers. Demi's is a sensibility to detail akin to Flemish painters like Van Eyck or Bosch, where details and textures become hallucinating and emphasize the unknowable. The darkness behind and around the child convey the mysterious. Demi's self-identification with children and their worlds is evident throughout her entire body of work, and she manages to do this with images that are always beautiful while charged with poignancy and pain. Frozen Charlotte on the left, 1986, is based on a Victorian period doll, in turn based on a folk ballad where a girl refused to wrap herself up with a blanket to go on a sleigh ride, and she froze to death during the journey. The painter places the figure on a mechanical pedestal where she holds on to two pole-like pieces of metal that have wings. For Demi, these represent her own asthma medicine, which opens up her lungs to breathe. The figure, if you pay close attention, is in a prison cell with a tiny window with bars on the upper left. The color palette is mostly icy blues and whites with pale flesh tones which evoke frigid temperature. It is a painting of loneliness and death, where the artist transforms a Victorian subject into something personal where both she and us can identify with the fragility of childhood. In 1994, a 7-year-old girl was beaten to death by her stepfather in Riviera Beach, Florida, and her body buried 4 days later by her mother and stepfather. This brutal act inspired Demi to paint for Christina Holt on the right. She has told me, "I was so moved by this tragedy. I felt so sad for the abuse and death of this little girl, but I could not paint it until 2 years after it happened." End of quote. In the horizontal picture, the figure appears lying down, covered by flowers, and held up by small wheels on sticks that seem to be transporting her, possibly to the beyond. She raises an arm upwards towards God, asking for help. The color arrangement of blue flowers and green tree complements the orange yellow that surrounds the figure and fades into the background, projecting a resurrection-like feeling around the child. It is not a gruesome literal image, but rather a poetic representation where the beautiful and decorative can help us mediate a difficult subject. Demi's paintings can also be fantastic expressions of joy, even as the children look at us with pensive faces. Merry-Go-Round of 1987 is a very good example of this. Now, merry-go-rounds represent the wheel of life and fortune, and also the loss of innocence as it moves round and round. In Demi's version, one child sits on the carousel horse and the other child sits on the side of the horse. The blue mane of the horse explodes into a profusion of lines that fill the left side of the painting, becoming a sea with fantastic fish. The blue is balanced on the right side with a peacock-like bird, also in blue. The rest of the background is filled with minutely painted small yellow and green leaves. Touches of red on the horse and the pole complement the overall greens, including two green rabbit-like critters. All of the figures are moving through space, achieving a fluttering effect over the entire surface. Traditionally, kites have symbolized prophecy and fate. Depending on the culture, kites can have minimally simple or very elaborate designs. In kites, the children are painted on the kites, are kites themselves, blending with birds and angels soaring through the sky. The bright colors and dense details remind us simultaneously of a rich Byzantine ceiling painting or even a medieval manuscript. The picture is an explosion of shapes and colors that fills us with awe. Among the works of DEMI that have garnered attention are her close-up, focused, and usually smaller portraits of infants, with dark backgrounds and the heads pressed up against the front of the picture plane. These are among her most austere paintings. In 1987, she painted the series Liquid Life. These were inspired by the Japanese tradition of burying the children of pregnancy terminations in a special cemetery of their own. Liquid Life 3, on the left, is a haunting image. The head is framed by a delicate bow at the top and an intricate pattern of white and blue flowers. Look at the eyes. They have a disconnected look, representing death. More humorous, but no less tender, is Pink Baby with Green Dress of 1990. The pink, chubby flesh contrasts with the green and white circular pattern of the dress and hat. The eyes make contact with the viewer, while the pursed lips attempt to smile. The face has that quality of certain infants that look like old men or old women, paradoxically reflecting wisdom and inexperience. Me and My Sisters of 1988 and The Ascension of 1996-97, to me, are among her most profoundly spiritual pictures. The first, Me and My Sisters on the left, pay close attention, evokes in its composition the image of Our Lady of Charity, La Caridad del Cobre, appearing at sea. In the center, there is a child wearing an elaborately detailed blouse and skirts and striped socks. She holds a photo in her hands of the three sisters. She sits in what seems like a very fancy boat. The sea around her contains various infants and seashells. Columns arise from the boat, which definitely evoke the silhouette of Our Lady of Charity, La Caridad. Floating babies with pieces of cloth at the top of the painting resemble angels. The orchestration of color complements the blue bottom and top of the work with the large orange and yellow area. The painting communicates serenity and transcendence. Consisting of complex and various greens and reds with flesh tones, The Ascension depicts a panoramic landscape with a verdant valley, and this valley has hills and trees that fill the background. In the foreground, 6 children, or perhaps the same child in different stages, occupy the space. A dark figure bearing his teeth appears in the left middle ground. Is that a guije, a Cuban elf that appears by rivers in the woods to scare humans and announce death? Possibly. While on the other side, a green bird, a symbol of hope, sits. The children or child is in a process of transformation. From the fetus on the lower left to the bird-like tree, child that is lifting off from the top of the head of the dark figure. Although a dark element is evident in the painting, again, the guije figure, it adds to the transcending quality. Pain and suffering are part of the human condition. Death is part of the human condition, but they can be overcome through the Spirit. Therefore, the ascension. Soulmates and lovers, the artist and her partner, sí, de vez en cuando sale el acento cubano. My wife, who is not Cuban, always says that after I have a couple of drinks, I start to sound like an intelligent version of Ricky Ricardo. I thought Ricky Ricardo was very intelligent, so I don't know what an intelligent version means. Soulmates and lovers, the artist and her partner, fellow painter Arturo Rodriguez, have been a recurring subject for DEMI. In Two Artists, One Love of 2003, they appear floating in a circle of blue flowers. Her head and upper torso lay on his lap while he caresses her hair. They are dressed like children. They are, in effect, children, innocent and pure. They exist in a gentle and secure world, which is their love. In 2014, DEMI completed what is perhaps her most violent and disturbing painting up to now, The Execution. This is the painting that I slept next to for almost 2 weeks while it was in progress. Before this work, the artist had alluded symbolically to her father's killing, as well as depicted him alive in the company of her mother, herself, and her siblings. This time, it will be a graphic and unsparing image, painted in reds and pink, purple, whites, grays, and blacks. The work compresses onto the foreground the falling body of the father as it is pierced by red spears and blood springs from the wounds. On each side of the body are two screaming figures that represents the artist and her mother. In life, they have both come screaming and crying to their home after the father's execution. In the background, a Ouija, painted in purple, appears with his eyes lifted towards heaven. The purity of the whites contrasts with the violent reds, and the convulsed, screaming heads add a sense of agony that is powerfully painful. And of course, it also reminds us of a secular deposition of Christ, with the weeping women at the foot of the cross. This painting shatters our sense of space and emotional distance. It rattles us with its directness, the way Goya's Executions of the 3rd of May does. Here is the inhumanity of man unfiltered, even more so because it is a part of the artist's lived experience. During the first two most difficult years of the pandemic, 2020 and 2021, DEMI painted the largest canvases she has ever worked on. One measuring 91 by 72 inches, the other 98 by 104 inches. She refers to these two paintings as her pandemic paintings. And they are like murals due to the scale, taking up the entire space of her studio while she was working on them. They are titled respectively, The Big Storm on the right, that's the largest of the two, and Light versus Darkness on the left. She began with The Big Storm. She would work on it for a week, then take it down and put up Light versus Darkness and do the same. She explained, I quote, "The big storm represents the pandemic. It is a painting with strong winds, pink flamingos flying and flipping over and away in the sky, and everything else that is surrounding them. Children are holding tight to their umbrellas, except one. A child whose umbrella is turned upside down, losing protection. The umbrella symbolizes the beautiful protection when I was by my mother's side as a child. I used a very somber palette of dark blues and dark violets, contrasting with pinks. Very thick paint was used with a large brush." End of quote. Light versus darkness is a constant theme in DEMI's work, what she calls, I quote, the vital and constant struggle, again, rooted in her religious vision of the world. Darkness is represented by a large dark blue mass that has eyes and a mouth. Light by a huge angel-like figure painted in gold. It is an image of a confrontation between good and evil, where goodness must, and I stress, must triumph. It is a painting about perseverance amid despair. And that perseverance for Demi is grounded in her faith in God. Her canvases are populated by children, many of which evoke ancient men and women. Her work is not sentimental or kitschy. On the contrary, it possesses a resistant quality that is hard, tough, and a beauty that can be hallucinating. She dismantles sweet and simplistic visions of childhood and provides instead a spiritual reckoning. Her art is in itself a life-affirming struggle that confronts us with its layered textures and orchestrations of rich color, grabbing and pulling us in, shaking and rattling us to illuminate us with its troublesome beauty. Looking at her paintings, I always think of that exquisite line by Emily Dickinson. I like a look of agony because I know it's true. Thank you.